Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. I decided to create this presentation for you given the scope and gravity of global events occurring at this time, and clearly history is in the making. Entitled The Astrology of 2020, Synchronicity of Global Events, this presentation can be best understood as part 2 to my initial presentation entitled The Astrology of 2020, The Dawning of a New Era. I invite you to check it out because it provides the bigger picture background to what I'll be focusing on today, which is more the spotlight on 2020 itself. So while that one did do that, it looked abroad to the era I'm talking about, which is a 200-year period linked to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is scheduled to occur this year on winter solstice 2020. And Jupiter and Saturn should be understood to be linked to the economy. So it's rather interesting that we're experiencing this massive global event, which isn't directly linked to the economy, but is certainly impacting it in a major way. How that will unfold is yet to be seen, but clearly it's already having a big, major impact, and it will invariably touch us all in more ways than one. Now, I'm going to provide you with some background, a bit about how we decide what represents a key moment in time to look at a chart. I mean, we can look at it at any given moment, but we usually will base it on the conjunction of two planets, which is very significant. But we can also look at the exact moment of midnight, for example, which launches the year at any given calendar year. Now, each year you could say that the launch dates are linked to winter solstice and 12 midnight on January 1st. In this regard, winter solstice can be seen as nature's launch pad, linked to the light of the sun, the cycle of the sun in relationship to the earth, and it very wonderfully establishes an exact 10-day countdown to New Year on the global calendar, January 1st. It's not always considered or understood that it's very precisely timed, and this is linked to the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar which very precisely measures exactly the 365.25 years or days in a year, right down to the minutes and when exactly the year begins. And again, these two moments in time, winter solstice and January 1st, are tied in to determine that. That's not something commonly known or understood, but it's interesting that it is. And we can use, therefore, either of those dates to look at the year ahead, winter solstice or January 1st. But winter solstice better looks at the season ahead, and the January 1st looks at the year ahead. And because it's the global calendar, everybody's focused on that day as well, so it reinforces it in our co-creative capacities. Now, the stroke of midnight on January 1st symbolizes the birth chart for the year. Again, this is based on mundane astrology, which means the generic perspective, but one which can be understood to affect humanity as a whole. So it can be parallel to what's called the solar return chart. The solar return chart is cast for the moment that the sun returns to the place it was when you were born. So it's a personal tool in astrology used for the personal natal chart, which around your birthday, or we can look forward or back at what was suggested at that exact moment when the sun returns on your birthday each year. So it's a really excellent tool to get a forecast for the year ahead. But what I've noticed is, I've certainly used this tool all the time with my clients, but this particular event that's unfolding with COVID-19 is sort of overriding some of the things I've seen, and that really has caught me by surprise a bit. I wasn't quite aware that that could or would happen to the degree that it has. So it really does suggest how unprecedented this event is. The larger global reality is having an override effect, so to speak, on personal destinies. And now, to what extent, I'm not sure, but it is. And it's not something we should expect to remain true, but it is currently true. I have lots of clients who are planning on going places, and certain dates were chosen very specifically suggesting that probable those dates would work well and they align well with the chart. Now, of course, such predictions aren't meant to be absolute. They're more supportive in terms of what constitutes the best window when. So there's different levels of interpretation when it comes to prediction, by the way. Some is meant to be more, this will happen, or on the other hand, this is the best time to make that decision. More what's called the electional astrology, when we elect to begin something. So that those two represent features of astrology that are interesting and important to know. Most people don't approach astrology with knowing these things, and not that they should, but it can be helpful to have a bit of background. That's what I'm doing here. So when we look at your natal chart or your solar return chart, we're gaining insight into your destiny, which will invariably manifest as outer events. That's basically how it works. The solar return chart emphasizes the themes for 1 year, and that's what we're doing here, very much tied in tidally to the calendar year of 2020. Now, so of course, each year is part of a continuum and can be understood as a chain link in a longer chain, whether we look at 10-year periods or 100-year periods, or whatever we do, each year has its own circle, shall we say, to it. And within it, even within 1 year, we can see that there's, 12 lunar cycles, and there's other, cycles going on, etc., with Mercury retrograde. So there are cycles within cycles is the classical way of defining that. So now your natal chart, of course, reveals the destiny for a lifetime, but the solar return chart looks at the year ahead as mentioned, and the themes and the timing of events is also woven into it. So the stroke of midnight on January 1st always occurs, by the way, when the sun is exactly at 10 degrees Capricorn in the tropical zodiac. Western astrology is based on the tropical zodiac, which is based on the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, and which are directly linked to the seasons and more specifically to the sun's light. So it's an astrology that isn't based on the constellations, by the way, but it does incorporate the constellations. And I've mentioned this before, but I'd like to bring it to people's attention every now and then, just to remind them that, yes, this Western astrology is not based on the constellations, although it does honor them and does incorporate them often into, astrological work. But the Western astrology is based on the sun's light. And it's a very beautiful spiritual reality linked to that as well, as you might imagine. Now, because winter solstice always occurs at 10 degrees Capricorn, that moment in time when at the strike of midnight on January 1st, we can say that's the birth chart for everyone, for humanity. That's our collective birth, you could say, and it provides thereby the opportunity to produce a solar return chart. Now, when we do astrology, we look basically at what's called the planetary weights. There's a lot of ways of interpreting a chart. It's real art and science that way. But when we look at weighing the planets, how heavy or how much does influence, quote unquote, does a planet have in a chart? And again, that's called weighing the planets. Now, there's a long list of techniques one can employ, and I've decided to work with 12. There's probably, well, quite frankly, there's hundreds, but there's some, some are more popular and for good reason than others. Some are a little bit more obscure and subtle than others. So these 12 are quite, prominent. So in the chart, which I'm going to show you, this is the chart itself, by the way, for New Year 2020. Again, looking at an astrology chart, a mandala, by the way, is a bit foreign to many people, and it can seem a bit intimidating, but all you're basically looking at here are, the signs. That's Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, and it goes in this direction. You see the numbers counterclockwise. And then these are the planets in the signs. And there's never more than 30 degrees in a sign, so that you'll never see more than 30 degrees here. And the minutes, there's, just like the clock, there's 60 minutes in a degree. So that gives you a little sense of what you're looking at when you look at these numbers. And it does matter a bit for what I'm about to show you, so I thought I'd mention that. So we're going to, I'm going to again give you the white paper breakdown of the main points we're going to look at regarding this chart, okay, and which again is cast for January 1st, 2020 at the stroke of midnight in Greenwich. We always use Greenwich because it's the 0 hour date location, so it's very appropriate to cast the chart for that location, even though it's in northerly latitude, but it doesn't matter in this case because the chart is cast for equal house. So you'll see every house cusp here, 10 degrees 00, 10 degrees 00, based on the degree of the sun. It's known as sun on the first house cusp chart, and it shows sort of the power of the sun. But you can actually do that for any planet in the chart, by the way. But the sun is the king of the castle, shall we say. Now, getting back to the list. So the first thing we have is a stellium of planets in Capricorn, which again, I'm going to refer to the chart in a moment to show you more clearly again. And then so a stellium is 3 or more planets huddled in a sign. And in this case, there was 5 planets, but there was 2 groupings. One of them was Sun, Mercury, Jupiter conjunct the lunar node in Capricorn, the south lunar node. By the way, that's important to note. The north and south node in astrology are important points, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But the other one is Saturn conjunct Pluto, which was very significant on that day to be applying or waning. So that means that Saturn, the slower moving planet compared to Pluto, is sort of like the moon to the sun. It's moving faster. So it's that when the sun and moon in their relationship, which produces new and full moons, what we see is that the sun is the slower anchor planet, and the slow planet is always the anchor, and the faster is the planet that, activates the new cycle by virtue of catching up after completing its round to that point again, called a conjunction. Anyway, we get also in that chart an exact conjunction between the moon and Neptune. That's very significant in the sign of Pisces, linked to COVID-19, which I'll explain in a moment. Then there was both Chiron and Uranus share the spotlight as the planet of lowest degree. Then you'll see Mars in this chart holding 4 key positions in terms of weight. So obviously Mars is very heavy, shall we say, holding a lot of weight of influence in this overall chart. It's the planet of highest degree of highest elevation in the chart in light of the sun as the epicenter focus of that chart. Then there's Mars is the final dispositor, meaning it's the planet in its own sign. And also it's the lead planet in what's called a bowl-shaped chart. Rather interesting that it has those 4 levels of influence in this kind of quick list. Then we have Venus unaspected in Aquarius. Very significant fact that a planet can be unaspected. And then Uranus was retrograde and is a singleton, which I'll explain in a moment. And Mercury in the chart in Capricorn was out of bounds. That's another fact that few people are aware of. Again, it's not just a matter of knowledge, but not even all astrologers focus in the same way as others. And knowing that a planet might be out of bounds is quite significant because it becomes sort of an extremist. All right, let's go back to the chart itself and have a look at this a little bit more clearly. Now, so here we have Capricorn, and this is the stellium of Mercury, Jupiter, Sun. That's the lunar south node, all huddled closely in Capricorn. That's 4, so that's a stellium. But these 2, Saturn and Pluto, are also in Capricorn, so they're part of the stellium in a wide sense. But it's sort of, you can look at it in both ways. But most importantly, you have 5 planets in Capricorn, and that's quite significant. And that was when I was referring to the governments having a very heavy hand this year. I mentioned that in the previous presentation, the Dawning of a New Era video. And what's most specifically important about that is it's linked to the fact that Capricorn itself represents governments, first of all. Now, more specifically, this Saturn-Pluto conjunction is the one that really grabbed our attention The last time this occurred was back in 1982, and there was a lot of changes in the world at that time as well, by the way. Quebec was close to just separating from Canada as one major event, but there's the economy was in trouble at the time, and there was a lot going on in the world back then. But more specifically, when you look at Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, and that's an approximate 30, it kind of ranges, there's a bit of a variable as to exactly how long between conjunctions, due largely to the fact that Pluto has such a strong or large ellipse to its orbit. It's very elliptical. Okay, so it's not a straight circle that it goes around the sun. It's in a very oval-like elliptical, and therefore it moves faster at certain stages of its orbit and then slower at others. And Saturn, of course, is doing the same, so the variable between the two is there, because Saturn has just a 30-year cycle and Pluto is a 246-year cycle. So it can be anywhere from about 34 to maybe 38 years between conjunctions between Saturn and Pluto, and they produce their own very significant period of time in history. So if you look at Saturn conjunct Pluto throughout history and what was occurring at that time, you would notice that, wow, there was major events. But they aren't always conjunct in the same sign. It's very significant to mention this. At the time in 82, they were in Libra. Now they're in Capricorn, the sign of government authority. And so this stellium is the main takeaway initially here is that the government authority has stepped in and is on a global level. So all the governments of the world are exercising a level of authority in a very unprecedented way, because we're in peacetime. So it's not like a call for martial law per se, but in some places it would appear that way because the military has been brought in here and there, especially, of course, in Italy, and the police, but the military at least back there. But the main thing to understand is that the governments are exercising a lot of authority, and in a very, dominant sort of manner. They're not, but it's interesting because they're not absolutely demanding or commanding what people will do, which is interesting, as would be the case with martial law, but they're strongly encouraging, but that's only currently true. We're not sure exactly what might come about because of this. But most specifically, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction here in particular was emphasizing the end of an old manner of behavior with governments, for example, which may have been a bit more laissez-faire, not get so involved. So although governments are always involved in creating policy and laws and so forth, this is revealing just how much influence they can have otherwise, right? In other words, it's not as big an impact, or hasn't been in this level of thinking for, ever, really. So the main point is when you have a waning planet, so in other words, Saturn here is behind Pluto, approaching, and the exact conjunction did occur on January 11th or 12th in some areas, and that is like the aspect of the year, really. It's the one that every astrologer was looking at, suggesting, wow, these two power players are going to have a big, influence on us all, and it's going to be a very strong exercise of power. Now, it just so happens that the exact degree of these two planets together is linked to Virgo, and Virgo is the sign linked to the environment, the ecology, to holism in general, by the way, and holistic health. So I would strongly venture that this will include a strong focus for us all for the future regarding how humanity participates in, business as usual thinking, and how this is impacting the environment. And of course, climate change is the main topic. That was the big theme last year, but it's kind of gone a bit quiet, but not altogether to sleep, of course. It remains a major theme, and the big question of does human activity have an impact on the environment? Well, clearly it does in different ways. Some of the ways are just pollution. Other ways are kind of invasively, marching into areas of the world where probably we should not go, and, turning valuable forest and land, jungles, forests, and so forth into farms, etc. is just not sensible, and we're beginning to wake up to realize that this can't continue. So it's interesting that the exact degree of these planets by synchronicity are, because nobody created this, nobody made this happen, there's nobody involved, there's no conspiracy here. It's the fact of the matter is they're just naturally there at that degree. And when they created the Gregorian calendar, centuries ago, I'm sure they weren't thinking of such a thing. So there you go. It's at that degree in the tropical zodiac, and Saturn behind Pluto just by 1 degree exactly. It's really quite something, that, by the way. And what, again, it suggests is that the governments will, in short, begin to exercise a lot more authority linked to how the world operates in terms of the free market, capitalism, if you like. Doing private sector, doing what it wants, how it wants, in varying degrees, and the rest of the world suffering under the weight of that kind of thinking. So it's always a tricky one regarding, democracy, capitalism, and democracy, socialism, and because too much socialism becomes very heavy government, and too much capitalism creates too much liberty in the private sector at the expense of others. So clearly we're at a place where we need to find the middle ground of those two extremes. And by the way, I just wanted to put a little aside note here quickly that there's one video I watched, and it was suggested that COVID-19 and the coronavirus family, because it's one of other viruses in that sort of under that umbrella, is linked in part to the environment. And it was suggested that it's not the last time we'll see a coronavirus. When this is resolved, we should be aware it's not the last time one will occur, probably, due to how humanity is interacting with the environment, the natural world. And this is where we get into this whole question of environment, government, and economy. Those 3 words, that's the real takeaway. That's really what's going on, folks. That's it right there. It's however else we may look at it, whether we think the government's become over-dominant or what have you, and, it has to play out one way or another, and governments from different countries will operate slightly differently. But what's happening positively also is there's a collectivity event here. All the countries of the world are kind of working together, really, positively speaking, and we're all being awakened to, very fundamental realities like health, hygiene, cleanliness, and, requiring both in the, marketplace, but also in the economy, in the, free market, that we can't go on as we have. We cannot just sustain, the planet cannot sustain business as usual attitudes. And so whether we decide that somebody's created this event to coincide is up to debate. But the main thing is that there's a synchronicity occurring. And that's what I want to really share with you. That, going into blame and suspicion and judgment is not going to help. And understanding the synchronicity is a very beautiful thing to understand in terms of the spiritual nature of reality. The fact that life does have a destiny, and we each have a destiny, and we are destined to exercise our free will in light of it. But there's a deeper story here, and I'll leave it there for now. So, okay, so we've had a little look, and I know that was kind of long, but the Capricorn sector of this main focus with the sun there in particular is the real takeaway. Now, that the sun Jupiter and Mercury are conjunct the South Node is significant because when in your natal chart, in your birth chart, for example, if you happen to have a planet conjunct the South Node, it's generally understood to be excessive. There's too much of that energy. So the 3 conjunct the South Node suggests the government may be coming down too hard. Not everybody would agree. Some would say no, not hard enough in some ways. So it's up to debate again. But you dovetail that with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, with Saturn waning. It's suggesting that the way the world used to be will no longer be what it will be. That's the end of that era. Governments will have more power, whether we like it or not. I'm quite sure of that. It's not going to be less government in the future, not more anarchy. None of that. No. I feel quite strongly about that. It's not what I want. This is not, I'm not sharing my political views and values and so forth with you. No, I'm offering you a prediction that from here on in, government intervention into what will occur in the world will become stronger. And positively speaking, governments, of course, sit between private interests and the people. And the people need to exercise leverage with the government. In other words, democracy is not something we get, it's something we do. So we have to do the democracy. And so we need government, therefore, to become very accountable. To become accountable, it has to become very transparent. So as it begins to exercise more authority linked to the environment, and subsequently due to the environment linked to the potential outbreak of future coronaviruses, that's the key thing to understand. This is not a random, arbitrary event. Okay, it's pretty much predictable based on our activity in the private sector linked to the environment. So it's not, every point is open to discussion and debate, and not everybody will agree, and there's all kinds of different levels of interpretation and suspicion and, perception and philosophy, etc. But the main thing you're hearing me say is that government power will become stronger from here on in, but at best, they'll be challenged to become more transparent, less catering to the few, the 1% if you like, or private interests, etc., and more transparently subject to the public being more politically aware. That's the ideal, and it's what I suggest will happen. So there's a bit of the suggestion of both what will happen, but what we need to do to work with that. Okay, that's the main message. That's a theme focus of this year linked to the new era that is being birthed in 2020. Okay, now that was a big talk there, so I'll leave that, all of that Capricorn. There's more in this. You can go on and on, to tell you the truth. The one that I did want to mention was Mercury in this chart is what's called out of bounds. So while it doesn't look like just at 4 degrees Capricorn, no big deal. But if we look at, this planet, there's ways of looking at the planets in such a manner that you can determine whether they're highly elevated in terms of their, what's it called? There's a phrase, Yes, I'm referring to the declination. That means how high a planet is, either above the ecliptic or below. And the sun and the tilt of the Earth's axis produce this very particular degree, which is 23 degrees 27 minutes. Very particular. Exactly that degree and those minutes. But a planet, for various reasons, in its own orbit around the sun, because the planets on their orbital plane is not always parallel to other planets. They each have their own kind of plane, so it's not flat as it would seem. Okay, so the main point is that a planet can at various times, and will invariably, be higher or lower than 23 degrees 27 minutes, and when they are, they're called out of bounds. An out of bounds planet is sort of it's very excessive. It shows that it's amped up. It's on steroids in a way. It's a bit reckless. It's not, it's compulsive. It's not smooth and refined and so forth. It's a very loud, impulsive, compulsive, radical sort of factor. So if you happen to have one, you'll notice whatever planet it is and whatever sign it's in, and the aspects are important too, you will have an extremist side of your nature. Now, that doesn't make you a bad person or anything, but it could be really helpful to know that that's true. And what can I do about that? How can I manage that? And that's where astrology is really wonderful. It can really help you see under the hood, so to speak. It can see you in a way that no psychologist, no counselor, nobody can see you in this way. It's a beautiful thing to understand, okay? And so this weighing of the planets is a powerful thing that we do as astrologers, and it's just so amazing to see one's destiny and how your life is an expression of that. And I want to mention that the astrology chart cast for the moment of first breath is not based on your genetics. It transcends your genetics, okay? It's not just based on social conditioning. None of those while those are both very valid and important factors in any of us, of course, but the astrology itself is not limited or subject to them per se. It's just another major layer of influence, the metaphysical layer, by the way. So we're looking at this Capricorn still, Mercury out of bounds, conjunct Jupiter. Mercury can be understood as the reporter and Jupiter the journalist. So the excessive degree of information coming from the media is the theme here. Now, some people would agree that there's too much from the media and there's a lot of hype and they're creating a lot of fear. Others are appreciative of the degree and scope of coverage we're getting. So again, it's a value judgment. But the main thing is there's a lot of it. And in some respects, it could be seen as excessive. And it's just the synchronicity is there. Okay, that's the main point. Now, let's turn our attention to Mars. I mentioned Mars being very high in the chart. Mars is in Scorpio. It co-rules Scorpio. So Mars rules Aries and co-rules Scorpio. Very important to note that that's the case. So when it's in Scorpio, it then is considered to be in honor because it's in the sign it rules. So that's its first strength. Secondly, it's the planet of highest elevation, so always based on the sun, but just the whole chart. I mean, in this case, we're emphasizing the sun as the epicenter, the 10 degrees, and the house cusps at 10 degrees. So, but we're just suggesting in any chart, whatever planet's closest to this point, the midheaven, the zenith of the chart, is the planet of highest elevation, and it therefore has extra weight. It has a lot of influence. It strongly suggests how you will be in the world, what you will do in your career. In fact, it has a influence and it can be decoded to determine, oh my God, yes, I do that type of thing. So rather interesting. Now, so it's both in its own sign, in honor, then it's the planet of highest elevation, but it's also the planet of highest degree. Okay, no other planet in this chart is as high as that. Now, the black moon, which I'll mention in a moment, is at 27, but it's not even a planet anyway. It's called a hypothetical point, and won't go into that too much here. But the main thing is Mars holds that position, and this year what we've seen is, it's been a really powerful year in terms of all the events that occurred in Iran and that violence shooting down of the airplane, the public plane, mistaken apparently for a military plane, etc. So that was that launched the world in a tragic way. And then, of course, all the fires in Australia was devastating for them and gripped the world into that focus. And now with a coronavirus, it's a violent thing. Mars and Scorpio, the sign of death and rebirth. So there's been a lot of death this year. And those are three of the main events. And of course, there are probably others that people could cite. But this coronavirus, which is really still just gaining momentum at this day. And by the way, it's St. Paddy's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. It's not the most exciting one after all, given what's going on and how many people are going to be just cavalier and casually at the pub tonight. There'll be some, as would be the case, but, as is true everywhere, people are staying home as they're being asked to do by the government. But anyway, the main point is that it's Mars in Scorpio is very potent, can be very powerful, can be very positively powerful, but it can also be seen as very violent. And that's what we're experiencing, a lot of violence and the shooting down of the civilian airplane in Iran, and but the drama that surrounded that, because there was more skirmishes going on between the American government and Iran prior with the assassination of their general, etc. So that's just kind of what happens in our world, but still was a point worth mentioning here. And then what was going on in Australia was major, very violent activity with those fires, very large span, encompassing large areas. And then with this now, and, people, the death toll, mounting by the day in the world, and, it's forecasted to continue to, some people are saying, well, who knows how many people, not everybody who gets coronavirus dies. They say about 20% will have to be hospitalized, and not even every one of those will die. So those, that's not 100%, it's not even 25%, but it's still significant in light of how quickly a virus can spread. And that's what humanity's being reminded about again right now. So Mars holds a lot of weight. Now, also I mentioned one more factor. It's the lead of a bucket. That means that there's two planets almost opposing each other. So when you have a bucket chart, that means all the planets are on this side. Now, the North Node's not a planet, so we won't worry about that. But all the planets are here, and that tends to produce high levels of new experience. So it suggests that this year will be a year of unprecedented experiences, new experiences, and we're seeing that. So we haven't experienced what we're all collectively undergoing on a global scale here with COVID-19 before. Not in a way where the response and how governments are communicating to people, just everything about it. It's just unprecedented. And this is still early in the year. It's not even spring yet, technically speaking. Spring equinox is in a couple of days from now. And wow, we have 3 major seasons to go. And there's other major events, which the previous presentation I did on era 2020, 2020 as the dawning of a new era, bring some attention to that, but I'll do more in the coming weeks as well to bring emphasis, especially Mars in its own sign of Aries. That's going to be quite major later this year. It's a bit of a worrisome factor, I must admit. But that's Mars holding a really strong, prominent position in this chart in Scorpio, very violent, and we haven't seen the end of that, I'm afraid, folks. Now, the other factor that I really want to bring attention to first is this Moon-Neptune exact conjunction. Now, an exact conjunction, even though there are 5 planets and the South Node in Capricorn in a stellium, that's obviously holding a lot of weight. And Mars, for all the reasons mentioned, it has a lot of weight. But whatever 2 planets are exactly conjunct tends to trump the rest, believe it or not. Now, that's a bit of a difficult call. Mars has a lot of weight, the Capricorn factor is very heavy, and the Moon Neptune is certainly very heavy. The main thing to understand here is that Pisces is the sign that represents the glandular system and that part of the body's defense against viruses and bacteria. Now, in medical astrology, Neptune's a real kind of wild card, and I'll get back to that in a moment. As far as medical astrology goes, Neptune's, as a planet, it's the kind of the least material. It's sort of here and everywhere. It's kind of non-localized. It's hard to explain Neptune. It's very oceanic in a sense that it's all around us. It's not given a specific location is true, but it's very particle and wave like. It's here, but it's everywhere at the same time. It's like the ocean or the air in some respects. All right, it's the same air we breathe all over the world, or there's only one ocean in the world, is that unless you have it inland. There's the few inland oceans, of course, of the world. But the main thing is that the Moon-Neptune conjunction is very symbolic of this virus. And while it wasn't cited clearly by many initially, it should have been really by us astrologers. We should have taken note that that very tight conjunction was going to manifest under the theme or influence of Pisces, which is very much linked once again to the glandular system and the body's first line of defense, once again, against, in particular, very specifically, viruses. So now the moon in astrology represents the people generally, just the people at large, if you like, the masses. So that the moon-Neptune exact conjunction in Pisces linked to the theme of viruses in terms of our health, etc., is very, holding such weight in terms of the exact conjunction, represents that the people at large, we're talking here about humanity, and the very fact that this virus is spreading globally is the main takeaway here. So I'm going to trust you understand what I'm getting at here, is that exact conjunction is very significant. Even though the others hold a lot of weight, it really, it's hard. It's a real tough call here. But some would say, no, that is the major signifier, the heaviest weight, even though there's only 2 involved with the 5 in Capricorn. But they really are at least in very tight alignment. And it does so happen that that aspect that they hold sits in the midpoint between the Sun and Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Right in the middle, which would be about 16 degrees, if you think. That's about 15 degrees and something. Almost 16 degrees is the midpoint. And that's another factor in astrology. So the midpoint is exactly in alignment with the Moon-Neptune conjunction. And they are in sextile, so it does suggest that this is actually, positively speaking, there can be some lemonade from these lemons that we're getting from the COVID-19. It's something's happening that could well be understood as positive. Why wouldn't we want to see it that way? Despite the tragedy, as not, taking lightly the fact that there's suffering and fear and anxiety and disruption, etc., going on the planet, and sickness and, all of the above. But that maybe something positive will come out of this, that maybe, and I think this will in fact occur. It will in fact, contribute to a new way that the world will govern itself. A new collectivity is emerging. And it's not a conspiracy to think that, we should and will have a more international coalition of governments operating in much closer unison. And that's the main theme there. Now, so there's much to be said about that. It's interesting to note that the black moon, I decided to include it here because it's in Pisces in the 3rd house in this chart, linked to the sun holding, reign on this chart. It is in that sign and in that house, it's all linked to themes of personal denial and blame. So it's like not taking responsibility for what's going on, feeling victimized, and feeling justified in blaming others. And it's the black moon is kind of a shadow principle, and it suggests that wherever it is in your chart represents an issue. You are a weak spot, an Achilles heel of sorts, something you have to overcome. And with awareness, you can. It's not like you're fated to suffer under the weight of it. But it's always there, like, again, like an Achilles heel. We all, wherever it is in our chart, tend to bump into it, or it's sort of this sore spot in our life somehow or another. Okay, and of course that sore spot that we have can be a sore spot for others too. In other words, they would recognize that issue, especially if it were defined in clear terms. Okay, so we've done a little bit there, and quickly now, I said also Chiron and Uranus hold the position of lowest degree. Now, the lowest degree planet in a chart represents where, how you begin the day. Now, Chiron isn't exactly as prominent a planet as the remaining planets in mainstream Western astrology. It's kind of like this maverick. It's not really a planet, sometimes referred to as a comet, sometimes it's a planetoid, and so forth. And there's one other term, I can't remember what it's called, but the main point is that it's kind of this maverick that you don't know quite what to do with all the time. But of course, most astrologers do now include Chiron in the chart because they know that it's very important. And it's known as the wounded healer principle. So it's interesting because Chiron in Aries, ruled by Mars, which holds so much weight in this chart, is prominent as the planet of lowest degree. And the Chiron Aries principle suggests that there's a wound in the sort of mode of personal self-expression in the world, especially linked to Mars in Scorpio. By the way, Scorpio is very much the sign of private interests. So it suggests that there's a wound in the attitude of the private sector, assuming that it can go in and do whatever it wants, wherever it wants, however it wants, just based on power and money and so on. And the governments kind of left holding the bag sometimes, but at worst, of course, are sometimes involved in the corruption of that as well. So it's rather unfortunate that way. So the main thing here is that Chiron in Aries is the planet of lowest degree, but it shares that because it's not an official planet with Uranus. Now, Uranus in Taurus represents the revolutionary establishment of a new foundation. Taurus is all about building on foundations, okay? And Uranus is very revolutionary. So in short, it's very much like a bulldozer principle here, really coming in and plowing the way to create a new world. So that's what's happening this year. The world will not be the same quite, at least not quite the same as it was. I mean, it's always changing, of course, but some turns are sharper than others and bigger. And this is a sharp, big turn we are collectively taking. Now, Venus is the one planet I haven't mentioned yet, and it is holding a very, very special role in this chart because it is unaspected. You'll see Venus at 14 Aquarius in what's called there's a specific set of rules in astrology what determines a planet unaspect. So I won't go into it because it's taking long enough to get through this, but I'll just rest assured it's unaspected. And an unaspected planet is known as a wild card. It can be described as unintegrated. And we need to decipher if it's in your natal chart or in your solar return chart, it suggests that it's not easy for you in that way, in that aspect of your personality, to integrate with the rest of your personality and by extension with others, society in general. So it makes you a bit out of sync or a bit clumsy, awkward. All of those words apply. It's just unintegrated, okay? And the person who has that can be a little oblivious to that. They don't quite see what others might be seeing. So it's not about judging other people or anything. It's just that with awareness, we can override the issue. That's the main thing. One of the main cornerstone themes of astrology for people at the more psycho-spiritual level is that awareness is the key for you to overcome the issue, and it can pinpoint it in an instant. It's not a long, drawn-out process of trying to decipher in some misty, murky way what it is. Within minutes, looking at your astrology chart, you can see that type of issue. Okay, and so it's really quite something. So maybe you personally or you are in a relationship with somebody you suspect there's something there, but it would be helpful to know more about, or you have a family member, a child, or somebody who's not integrating well, etc., and you can understand it and then thereby be able to do something better with it by that understanding. And that, again, is the key. So that provides a pretty good overview of what's going on. This whole chart, suggests that or reveals the synchronicities that are going on in the world linked to major government with massive power, the change of power, authority, and how it's exercised, that the old tradition, Capricorn and Saturn are linked to tradition, is changing. We're taking an abrupt turn away from a sort of traditional, matter-of-fact, business-as-usual attitudes. And this year will lead us out of that thinking. Make no mistake. It may be early in the game, it's the beginning, but it's here. It's not going away. It's the beginning of a new era. And again, my previous video does contribute to that understanding. With Mercury in the wild card position, we can expect the media will be playing a major role all year long. In some ways, excessive to some, but in positive senses, they'll really be making a major contribution. But the outer balance planet tends to be compulsive. Remember that. So you have to kind of take a bit of a break or a bit of a diet from too much media and too many opinions flying from too many sectors. And of course, that's the reality with the internet in this day and age, isn't it? After all. Mars, it's birthing processes tend to be violent. We all know that, and painful. And so can we say there's something natural about that? In a way we can. The Kali force, as would be true in mythology, the Kali force is the destruction, or the Shiva force, that the old must be destroyed for the new to come in. Now, nobody wants to be guilty of deliberately doing such a thing where others are harmed, but it happens at all kinds of levels, whether in nature or between countries, governments. The Kali force is a powerful, or whatever, however you wish to define it, there is this destructive aspect to existence which is sort of necessary to our growth. So it's worth seeing it that way, in as positive a way as we can, and learning to be cooperative and adaptive to the realities that we face. So it's getting into blame and judgment and victimization that Black Moon in Pisces there represents is the issue to overcome. So that's really important that we see that and not go into that attitude of those blaming and feeling victimized attitudes that is common to people to do. So it's probably, if ever there was a time for us all to cooperate and, not to take a rebellious stance regarding what governments are doing, I think this is a good time for that, I must admit. But at the other end of the scale, it's a time inviting us to realize that governments will invariably exercise more authority in the years to come, in the decades, in the centuries to come. And in that regard, people must step to the plate to become more politically aware and demand that governments be more transparent so that we can exercise leverage over them. And that's, the whole idea of electoral processes, isn't it? We need to not think and assume democracy happens. It's something that we must do. And that's our collective responsibility. So there we go. That's a look at the whole picture, in a summary way. There's always more, quite frankly. And I can, you can go on and on with these things. And it is new to some, this kind of language, these kinds of insights. But I'm going to trust that you got something out of what I just shared with you. There's a lot of detail, and it's quite explicit, really, in detailed ways. And it does provide also an insight into your own astrology based on your own birth chart, and also what's called solar return charts, which represent the themes and events destined to occur in any given year linked to your birthday. Okay, so thanks for being here. I hope you enjoyed that. And as I said, I will be creating more of these videos to help people better understand what's going on. So I invite you to subscribe to my channel and leave me a message and comment below as well, if you wouldn't mind. And let's enter into a conversation about this. So thanks again, and see you next time.